Welcome to the Learn By podcast. I'm Valentina.
And I'm René.
And together we talk about practical tips and tools for teachers around formative action and other effective pedagogy. Try to keep it short
and brief.
Anything we mention you can find in the show notes. Want to know more about what we do? Check out our website, formativeaction.com, where you can find our book, blogs, and online courses.
So I'm sitting here today with my wonderful co-host, Valentina Devid.
Yes.
And the subject for today is turning formative assessment into action. So why is this an interesting topic, Valentina?
Well, it's a popular topic because lots of teachers all around the world are trying to put formative action in their practice, but at the same time finding it very hard turning the information that they're collecting in their classroom also into purposeful action. So I guess that's one of the problems that teachers are facing or experiencing in their practice. And another problem that our teachers can experience is that they struggle to find the time to implement formative action successfully in their classroom. And also what can be troublesome is that sometimes students are not engaged enough in formative action as well, or formative assessment, that students don't take it seriously.
Yeah, so that's why we'll be discussing in this podcast episode a number of themes. So the first thing is that we're going to discuss is why you should start calling formative assessment action, as you just did, Valentina. Why you should predict possible problems in your lessons. Why you should do spear fishing instead of troll fishing. That you shouldn't mark your formative assessment. That you should plan for an action step. And finally, we're going to discuss what are you going to do if you can't predict the problems in your lessons, for example, because you're an ECT.
So, okay, René, let's first start with our conversation with talking about the term. So everybody is calling it formative assessment. Why? Because you changed this term, actually. You changed the name. Why did you change it into formative action?
Yeah, so I started calling formative assessment formative action about 6 years ago. So that was in 2018. I had tried it out a couple of times in front of teachers, and it seemed to work. Because one of the things I felt was a problem was that teachers started were hanging up on the term assessment. So when you were talking about formative assessment, they were all thinking about assessment. And then they sort of figured, well, if a summative assessment is an assessment with a grade, then maybe formative assessment is assessment without a grade and with feedback, for example. And that's not a very helpful way to look at formative assessment. So what I tried to do is I tried to change that focus and to steer them away a bit from assessment. So I started calling it action, because if you look at what you're trying to do when you're doing formative assessment, is actually trying to adapt your lessons to your students' needs, trying to gather information about how they're doing, and turning that into action. So I figured if I call it action, that would be a good way to get teachers focus on the aspect that really matters. It's like turning information into action. So I've started using that term since 2018, and it really caught on. So in the Netherlands, everybody's talking about formative action and not about formative assessment. So when we wrote our book in Dutch about that transition that we made, and we translated that book to England, we also introduced the term formative action. And we're starting to get the sense that a lot of people are, getting used to the idea that calling it something different actually helps in making a new conceptualization. Because what you really want is that formative action to place that not in the realm of formative assessment or of assessment, actually. So you don't want to place it in assessment because assessment has different rules. You really want to place formative action into your pedagogy, like the stuff you do in your lessons from day to day, from minute to minute. That's where formative action belongs. And it should stay far away from the assessment part of it.
And why is it you think that changing the language matters so much? Why is it so important?
Well, I think that language always matters, like how you say it and how you talk about it makes a huge difference in how you enact it actually into practice. But I couldn't fathom right from the start what it would actually do. So to me, it was just like I want to get teachers focused on the action part of formative assessment. But in the years in between, since 2018, we've really developed the concept along further. And one of the things that we found out is that, for example, for effective feedback, you always need an action step or a landing space, as you call it. So that's something that where the action started to come back into the equation again. And also, in order to be able to turn information into action, you actually need to do orienting and predicting. It really brings the whole action bit actually brings all the things that you need to do to make formative assessment effective. It really puts all those things together by laying that focus on action. Okay, the second thing we will be discussing is predicting possible problems. So in order to do formative action properly, you need to predict the possible problems your students might have in your lesson. Can you explain?
Yeah, so as a teacher, it's very important if you want to put the information that you're gathering with formative action, as we like to call it, into action. It's crucial that you as a teacher think beforehand of the typical problems or misconceptions or pitfalls that you can expect that your students will be having or might have. And you have to do a prediction, like, okay, if I'm going to ask this or that question, or I'm going to quiz this or that, what can I expect that my students will have difficulty with? If I'm going to talk about this or that topic or lesson goal or lesson objective, what are the most common pitfalls and misconceptions that my students have? And if you actually taught for a couple of years, you probably know pretty well what to expect, actually. And to give an example of what you can think of, I'm a history teacher, or used to be a history teacher. And a very funny but very real misconceptions that my students often had is that they were finding it difficult to keep clear or keep in mind what is the difference between Martin Luther, the German Christian priest and reformer, or who was Martin Luther King, the American minister and activist and very prominent leader for civil rights. And those two men are totally different figures in history, and it's a bit embarrassing, of course, if your students are still changing them on their summative test. So that is a typical example of prediction of that I can do as a teacher beforehand, and it's also something that is very important to me that my students can that they grasp that correctly, actually.
Yeah, and a very good way to predict possible problems is by thinking about diagnostic questions developed by Craig Barton, who's made an entire point about setting up multiple choice questions in your formative assessment, where you try to predict the possible problems your students might have and to have answer options that help you identify the misconceptions that your students might have.
And also, if you find it hard, you can try to ask your colleagues, and especially if you as a teacher are starting and you haven't taught that long, it's a very interesting to do is to actually ask your more experienced colleagues what they predict typical pitfalls and misconceptions, what typical misconceptions and pitfalls are, what your students can have. And it's a very good thing to talk about with your colleagues as well.
So how does predicting help you to turn information into action?
So if you beforehand made the predictions, what you gain is that in the moment when you're looking at all the information that you gathered from your students, you make sure that you're not startled because you already know what you are expecting, and it makes it easier to act upon the information that you gathered with your quiz or with your question on the mini whiteboard or something like that. And if you haven't made the prediction beforehand, what can happen is that you get overwhelmed. You just see all the answers, and it's very hard to make a very quick decision also in the moment with all your students in front of your nose, making noise or, looking at you, what are you going to do next? So it really helps you in the moment to make a decision of how to move forward, of what to do, what you want to act upon. And because you already thought of that, you already have in your mind, like, okay, if they answer A, I'm going to do solution B, or if they answer C, I'm going to act upon it this or that way. So it really helps you to act in that moment and not to be startled, or in the worst case, just move on with the lesson as you planned to and not reacting at all on the information that you gathered. So René, I heard you talk about spearfishing and thrallfishing, and I think for our listeners who are thinking like, what the heck? What are you talking about? You have to explain that very strange metaphor.
Okay, so what we're usually saying is that your formative action should look like spearfishing and not trawl fishing, which basically comes down to this. If you're fishing and you're spearfishing, you're sitting in a boat and you have a spear in your hand and you're looking for that one fish. And what you're doing is jumping into the water and then try to get that one fish with your spear. And if your formative action looks not like spearfishing, but actually like trawl fishing, then what you're basically doing is you're throwing out a net and then you try to catch everything. And you're not just catching too many fish, but you're also catching bicycles and other rubbish, and you're dragging them on your boat. And then you're looking at it and going like, well, what do I want with this? Right? There's so much stuff. What am I going to do with it? So if your formative action feels like that, so you make them write down their answer on the mini whiteboard and then put that up in the air, or they write something on Padlet and they're just throwing all those answers on the internet, and you're looking at it and going, well, what am I supposed to do with this? Then you're probably trawl fishing and not spear fishing. So what you want is your formative action to feel like spear fishing. I was looking for this fish and I found it, or I was looking for this fish and I didn't find it, but that's a good sign. And that's, a very important feeling to have when you're trying to do formative action in your lesson, because that makes it way more actionable. If you have way too much information, it's very hard to turn it into action. And you have like one fish, you find that fish, then you know what to do with that fish. And so this is where prediction also comes around. So if you're not predicting the fish that you're looking for, then in the lesson, you're probably not going to look for it as well.
What also really was a very important moment for me was I used to quiz my students a lot. And what is very easy to do online is that you find other quizzes of other teachers. And it's very easy to just, import questions into your own quiz that other teachers made. But the pitfall here is that it's not your question and you didn't make a prediction also that belongs to that same question. So when I quizzed my students and I thought I made a very good quiz, they said to me, "Miss, we didn't have, we didn't cover this topic. We didn't talk about this." So I was maybe spearfishing, but I wasn't consciously spearfishing, but because I was asking questions that I, didn't talk about in my lessons. So.
You were basically spearfishing like lots of fish.
Blindly, I don't know. It was just very bad spearfishing, I guess. I'm sorry.
So our next point is that marking should not be a part of a process of formative action. And I know a lot of teachers are very enthusiastic about marking. So Valentina, can you please explain to me why marking shouldn't be a part of formative action?
Well, first of all, I don't know what you like to do with your time, but I don't like marking. And I think there are a lot of us here that also don't like, throwing away lots of their time with marking. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, and maybe that's even more important, is that if you spend an hour of your time marking the work of your students in order to come up with an action step, then the costs and the benefits aren't balanced. And probably something is wrong here, because if you make a good prediction with the right question, then you can spot the errors very quickly because you have a really clear view of what you're looking for, actually, and you don't have to spend a lot of time marking. So again, here is having a clear view on, you have to orient, what am I looking for? What is my prediction here? What can I expect? And then you have to come up with the right question to ask your students. And then you don't have to spend a lot of time marking at the same time. And also another thing is that marking should not be the focus here, because with the process of formative action, we're actually focusing on helping our students towards their next step in their learning process. So we're collecting information of their learning process, not to mark it or to grade it or something like that. That's not our focus here. Our focus here is pedagogy and making sure that we organize effective pedagogy. So we're really trying to help them to get to that next step. And I think that's also really something here, that you have to be clear on what is our focus and what is our goal with formative action. And it's not marking or grading. The next thing we're going to talk about is planning for an action step. And this is where the action comes into action, of course. So René, can you tell us a little bit more what to think about and how teachers can do this well?
So usually when teachers are doing formative action in their lesson, they will probably be asking their students a question. Students will generate some kind of output, and then you will spend some time interpreting and communicating about the answers they gave. So, for example, if you let them vote in your classroom, you'll ask a question, you give them a couple of answer options, they'll vote, and then you'll ask them, okay, so what did you vote? What did you choose? And why did you choose that answer? So you're trying to get more of a grip on their thought process, like what's going on in their head, so that you can decide on a proper follow-up action. But sometimes we saw as teachers, just doing these two steps. So they were asking their students a question, they were generating outputs, they were then discussing that output and then stopping, like not doing anything with it. And they were like, okay, well, that was, we all learned and then it stopped. So what's very good is when you actually plan for that action step, like make a mental exercise for yourself, like what am I going to do? And what can I let my students do based on the predictions that I made? So in the first step in our model that you can find on our website, you make a prediction about the kind of things that you're looking for. But then you can also think about, well, if these are the misconceptions that I'm probably going to find, then I'll need these and these materials, or I'll need these and these slides in my PowerPoint, or whatever you're using, in order to properly address that misconception as soon as it shows up. So in a way, you need to actually plan that action step, like make room for it and say, well, I'm going to do these and these activities, and then I'm going to spend some time fixing any problems that I find. But you also need to think about, and what am I going to do during that action step? And there's not like a whole, it couldn't be everything. It's probably just a couple of things. And maybe you just need to have some worksheets ready, or just have a PowerPoint ready, or just be prepared to reteach something if you really need to. But making that prediction and actually making that space for that action step actually helps to turn that information into action.
Can you maybe summarize what kind of follow-up actions there might be?
Well, possible actions are, for example, continue. So what you could do as teachers, just say, well, all is well, so I'm just going to move on. You could also repeat. So you could consider briefly explaining the things students seem to have forgotten. You could revise so that they can improve on their work. For example, adjusting their answer on the mini whiteboard, or changing whatever product they've been working on. You could do a reteach. Sometimes you just have to fully reteach something because they've forgotten everything, it's just something that happens. And you could decide on exercising. So when you say, well, we just need some more practice in order to overlearn it, for example. So these are like some options that you have for that follow-up action. Okay, so prediction is a very important part of turning information into action. And But there might be situations where you just can't be able to predict what the problems your students might have. For example, when you're in ECT, you just started teaching, it would be very hard to make predictions about what your students might struggle with. So what advice would you give, Valentina?
Well, I think it's a very easy or maybe obvious advice, but at the same time, a very truthful one, is that you ask your more experienced colleagues. So ask your colleagues, and especially the ones who are teaching way longer than you already, like to tell you what the typical problems or misconceptions are that students might have on this or that question or a specific topic. And what you can also do is maybe together with your colleagues at a meeting, try together formulating questions and also formulating typical answers that students might give, and then also putting the misconceptions in those answers. Because in the end, if you're finished with that building the questions and the answers with your colleagues, you will have fantastic diagnostic multiple choice questions. So I think that just asking your colleagues, talking to your colleagues, maybe together making diagnostic multiple choice questions and putting the misconceptions in the answers options is a fantastic thing to do.
Yeah, another thing that you might consider, maybe also if you're not in ECT, but for example, you're teaching a grade that you haven't taught before, and then sometimes it'll be very hard to predict the problems you might encounter. So one of the things you could do, and I have done in the past, is using an exit ticket. So because an exit ticket, you use it at the end of the lesson, and it will give you some time between lessons to analyze what they wrote down. And usually sometimes it'll look a bit like troll fishing, but, because you're not in a lesson, you have some time to actually look through things. And what you could do is, of course, I'm not suggesting that you mark it, but you could look for like interesting answers and interesting misconceptions that you found. And then, for example, make a few pictures of the work that they did so that you can bring them to your next lesson and then discuss them with the group. Like, these are the things I found and found them very interesting. So let's just discuss these answers and what they might have looked like. But actually using an exit ticket to give you some more think time and to analyze if you don't know what your students might struggle with. It's not the most cost-effective way to use formative action, but it is a way to circumvent this problem if you have it. All right, so in conclusion, we're just gonna give you some thinking time and to reflect on the things we've learned in this podcast. So the first thing we'd like you to consider is we discussed why you should call formative assessment formative action. Why was this again? Please consider why you should be spearfishing instead of troll fishing. So what was that metaphor really about?
Think of a typical misconception for your own subject.
We've discussed two options on what you can do when you can't predict the problems your students might have. Which were they?
René formulated 4 possible ways of how you could organize your follow-up action. Which were they?
And in conclusion, what was the subject of this podcast? So this was me, René Kneyber, and Valentina Devid, my co-host, and we thank you for listening to this episode.